some people in the waiting room. Okay. Good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are connecting. Welcome to today's Paula Kantor seminar. We're very pleased to have external presenter. Marvin Benali is with us from the Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division, ESP, or for those of you who are familiar with FAO. He's with FAO, based in Rome. And Marwan will be presenting some of the key insights and findings of FAO's recent report on the status of youth in agri-food systems. You may have come across this report. It was launched a bit earlier this year, I think in June or July, the summer months. So it's quite a big report, and I guess many people were involved in its production. So we're very pleased, Marwan. Thank you once again for being with us and for sharing the findings of the report. And after the Marwan's presentations, also with us is Kristin Davis from IFPRI. She's a senior research fellow in the Natural Resource and Resilience. I don't know, do we call it unit, Kristin? Division, chapter, unit?
Unit.
Good. And she's with IFPRI based in South Africa. So thanks to all of you. And I would hand over to Marwan for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, for the very kind invitation, and thanks everyone for attending and your interest in this report. Let me share my screen and the presentation. Oh. All right. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
All right. No, so thank you very much again for the invitation. Very pleased and honored to present this report in the Paula Kantor seminar. So as mentioned by Michael, this report is entitled Status of Youth in Agri-Food Systems. And the idea would be to present a few insights and key findings from the report. So before really delving into the main findings of the report, just wanted to give a bit of a background and motivation for the report. So why the focus on youth and agri-food systems? Well, there are about 1.3 billion individuals aged 15-24 in the world today. They represent about 16% of the world's population, and nearly 85% of this youth population live in lower income countries, especially in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And those are regions where agri-food systems are key sources of livelihoods, including for youth. And there is also a lot of hope vested in agri-food system to provide jobs to the future cohort of youth that will enter labor markets over the next decades. However, youth still face a lot of challenges, including in engaging in agri-food systems, and I'll discuss and mention some of them later in the presentation, but that could include low wages, informality, limited access to resources, and exposure to risks and crisis. But at the same time, youth are essential for innovation, sustainability, and intergenerational renewal in agri-food systems. So ensuring youth-inclusive agri-food systems transformation is important, both for enhancing youth welfare and livelihoods on the one hand, but also building sustainable and resilient agri-food systems on the other hand. So just a snapshot of the report, and as mentioned by Michael, was recently published about 3 months ago, and it aims to be a comprehensive overview of the status of young women and men across agri-food systems, and it's structured in 3 parts. The first one is really looking into defining the opportunities, and it's analyzing demographic data and opportunity spaces for youth in both urban and rural areas. The second part is really looking into outcomes and specifically on how youth engage in and benefits from agri-food systems along 3 main outcomes that we selected for this report, namely decent employment, food security and nutrition, and resilience. And the last part, consisting of the final chapter of the report, is really reflecting on how and under which conditions youth can act as catalysts for agri-food systems transformation. Before going into the findings, I wanted to say a few words on the conceptual framework of the report. So on the one hand, the report considered the broader environment that youth live in. So that includes the economic opportunity space they live in, and I'll say a few more words in the next slides on this, but also the national environment, so the level of structural transformation and agri-food system transition of the countries they live in, but also the local conditions, such as biophysical resources, laws on water, climate, market access, mobility conditions, etc. The report also considers youth-specific factors that include youth characteristics such as age, gender, ethnicity, disability status, their access to assets and resources, as well as their agencies. And both sides itself, the framework together, jointly shape the outcomes that we discuss in the report, that is decent jobs, food security and nutrition, and resilience. For some of the country level analysis, we're using the Agrifood systems typology that was developed by Quinn et al. And further adapted by Arslan et al. And it basically ranks countries into 6 different types of agri-food systems. So they're listed here: protected, crisis, traditional, expanding, diversifying, formalizing, and industrial, based on 4 indicators that you can see on the graph. I just want to say it's not reflecting necessarily a linear transition, linear relation, but it's mostly showing the transition process, and each of the agri-food system types have their own opportunity and challenges. And then at the subnational level, we adapted the rural opportunity spaces framework that was developed by IFAD in their rural development report in 2019 to characterize the spaces where youth live. And we basically characterize them according to the connectivity potential and their agricultural productivity potential. And very quickly, when it comes to youth, we rely on the UN definition of youth, that is individuals that are aged 15 to 24. But in some analysis, some aspects of the report, we also consider other groups or specific groups such as those aged 15, 17, 18, 24, or also all younger adults that are aged 25, 34. All right. In the next few slides, I'll be presenting and discussing 11 findings, general findings from the report. And the first finding is really that as agri-food systems evolve, so does the role of youth. I already mentioned that a large share of global youth reside in lower and middle income countries. And this graph plots the share of rural children and youth who age below 25 with the FS rank. So on the left side, of the x-axis, we have protracted and traditional agri-food systems, and on the right side, more formalized agri-food systems. And we see different groups of countries. And on the left side, we have countries with more traditional agri-food systems, and those countries have large and growing youth populations. While on the other side, we have countries with more formalized agri-food systems that have lower shares of rural youth. And that really comes with different policy implications for the different group of countries in terms of their youth context of youth abundance and youth scarcity. So in the context of youth abundance, one key strategy would be to create employment for the next cohort of youth or the large cohort of youth, and the role that agri-food system will play in the latter. While in the context of youth scarcity, one key element to consider is really how to make agri-food systems attractive for youth. The second finding from the report is that opportunities are not equal for rural youth. Despite the urbanization process, 46% of global youth population still live in rural areas. And there are unequal potential of the spaces where youth live. So as you can see on the right-hand side of that graph, most rural youth live in areas with high agricultural productive potential and moderate to high market access. Yet there is a non-negligible share of youth that live in areas with low opportunities, and that still hides some inequalities and heterogeneities. So for instance, in countries with protected crisis agri-food systems, only 2% of rural youth live in areas with highest potential. So that would be the top right corner in that graph, for instance. Oh, sorry, my bad. Another analysis wanted to do was to see how the spaces where youth live would be affected by climate change in the future. And we found that 395 million rural youth currently reside in areas that are projected to experience some decline in agricultural productivity in the future due to climate change. The next series of findings are related to youth mobility and migration. And what we found is that youth are highly mobile, particularly internally. So they have high rates of migration within their countries. That being said, I still want to mention that the number of youth migrating internationally also grew between 1990 and 2020 from 22 million to about 32 million. But in the context of lower and middle income countries, and you can see the graph on the right based on data from DHS data from 26 countries, rural-to-rural migration is prominent, especially in lower income countries. So this is on the graph, the dark purple bars. And such youth migration processes is linked to other life transitions than moving from youth to adulthood. It can be linked to employment, education, and marriage. And this leads us to our next finding on migration is that those migration patterns differ by gender. So again, with using the HS data from the same country, we found that in most countries, with a few exceptions, 3 exceptions here was Cambodia, Mozambique, and Gabon, female youth migrate internally at higher rates than young men. And not only they migrate at higher rates and are more likely to migrate, but also more likely to migrate at an earlier age. So in the higher proportion of migration among women was found at the age of 22, while for men it was at the age of 25. And this can also be linked to the reasons for migration. So as you can see on this graph, marriage and family drive migration for both young men and women. So those are really the two central bars in the heat maps, let's say, that are a bit more reddish. And for both men and women, marriage and family are important factors and motivations for migration. While young men also tend to migrate more for employment and jobs. So this is really on the left side of the heat map. So after completing the education, they tend to migrate for employment. The third chapter of the report was really focusing on youth access to resources and assets. And the main message was that rural youth lag behind urban youth and adults in access to natural and productive assets, which eventually limit the establishment of independent livelihoods. And in agriculture, for instance, young people's inadequate access to inputs, machinery, and technology negatively affect their propensity to eventually work in agriculture and in broader agri-food systems. There are some, what we found is also that there are some significant gaps in data and evidence related to youth access to natural resources. We also looked at, in the report, we also looked at other types of resources, such as physical resources, financial and digital resources. And interesting things that there are some contrasting stories. For instance, in financial access to financial assets, youth are less likely than adults to own a financial account, 66% of ownership versus 79%. But youth are also more likely to be digitally connected than adults, right? So 81% of global youth use internet versus 69% of adults. In the next few slides, I just want to give a few more details on accessing agricultural assets and especially land, for instance. So land access is out of reach for many youth across agri-food system types. So this is, again, compiling data from DHS surveys, and we find that about less than youth have access to land. And many factors explain this, such as delayed inheritance, because older adults may use and keep the land for a longer while for their livelihoods. There might also be rising costs of the land consolidation, land fragmentation, and less land available, and also lack of capital for youth. As a result, youth operate smaller farms than adults. So this is really that graph using household surveys from Ulis and comparing youth-headed households and adult-headed households, so that youth really operate smaller farms than adults. And the consequence is that, I mean, what we see is that the farm expansion tend to occur or might occur throughout the life stage, but that limits youth ability to really generate decent income from farming. In the same vein, youth are less likely to own livestock. And when they do own livestock, they're also less likely to own capital-intensive livestock such as dairy-generating livestock. And young women are in general more likely to own poultry. And youth also disadvantaged in accessing improved seeds, fertilizers, both inorganic or chemical fertilizers. We were also interested in looking at youth access to education, and in general, what we found is that rural youth have lower access to quality education. So taking the example of lower secondary education, 75% of rural youth complete that stage of education compared to 85% of urban
Marwan?
youth. Yes?
Sorry, Marwan, is it
Yes?
just me? The presentation for me, I'm still on number 5, use faces challenges. I'm not sure
Oh,
if it's me or if the presentation got stuck somewhere. I'm on slide 15.
I'm on slide 18. Can you see the
I
slide
see
moving?
18.
You see 18? Okay, then it's me. Don't worry. Just
Okay.
continue.
Ah,
Sorry.
okay. All right. No, thanks for letting me know. All right. Let me know if it stops again. Thank you. All right. So what we also found is that the gender gaps, there are gender gaps between rural young women and rural young men, but those gaps tend to narrow as agri-food system transition. So here as an example, we have data from countries with traditional agri-food systems and countries with diversifying agri-food systems, and we can see that the gaps between young rural men and young rural women tend to narrow. Another study that we reflected upon in the report also showed that only almost 40% of youth have completed vocational education, and literature also showed that youth have a limited engagement in agricultural extension and advisory services. All right, the next chapter set of findings is really focusing on outcomes, and we start with a few slides on engagement and youth employment in agri-food systems using ILO country level data as well as microdata. And one of the main findings is that agri-food systems are a major employer for youth. So globally, a bit less than half of the world working youth, 44%, are employed in agri-food systems, against 38%, sorry, of adults. There's some regional variation. So we find up to 68% of working youth in sub-Saharan Africa are in agri-food systems, and 52% in Southern Asia. So those are the two regions with the higher rates. What we also find is that youth employment in agri-food systems declines with agri-food system transition, but it is both for youth and adults with a decline of about 10 percentage points between 2005 and 2021. We also find a change in the structure of employment in agri-food system that's shifting from agriculture to off-farm agri-food systems. While we find an exit in agri-food system, we're interested in understanding what was the pattern of those exits. When youth exit agri-food system, what do they do? And what we actually found is that for both men and women and across almost all types of agri-food systems, the exit from agriculture is somehow coinciding with an increase in school participation. So also higher entry in our exit of the labor force, but we also see an increase across all agri-food systems of the share of young men and young women that are of working age that are in school. And agri-food, the next finding is that agri-food systems are key, not only for youth, but also very key for younger youth that we define here as 15 to 19 based on the data available. So as you can see in that graph, across almost all agri-food system, most of the higher rates of youth age 15 to 19 that are in agri-food system and mostly in agriculture. So our assumption is that agri-food system are critical entry points for those youth who start working on one's farm or the household farm. But we do find differences between men on the left side of this graph and women on the right side of the graph. There is a C-shaped distribution, as you can see here with those arrows, with young men that are actually exiting the sector more quickly than young women who tend to stay longer in agri-food systems and rely more on agri-food systems as adults before having both men and women at, let's say, age 65 plus working primarily in agri-food systems. Beyond the binary, let's say, engagement, right? I mean, the engagement studies in agri-food systems also used microdata to understanding whether this also translates into the full-time equivalent. So this is data, microdata from 6 countries, 5 sub-Saharan African countries and Peru. And we also find this confirmed that younger youth, so on the left-hand side of the both graphs, are more likely to allocate larger shares of their time to household farming as well as agricultural employment. And this is also more prevalent among young women than young men. And that reliance on agri-food system also perseveres through time. So we're interested in understanding patterns of intergenerational mobility of youth whose parents already work in agriculture and agri-food systems. So the graph here on the right-hand side shows the probability of young men and young women whose parents are working in agri-food systems. So for those youth, what are the probabilities of working outside agri-food systems? And we found that in general, countries with higher productivity growth, right, that are advancing towards the structural transformation process have higher rates of intergenerational mobility outside of agri-food systems. But this is also unequal between young men and young women. In most countries, young women are less likely to experience that intergenerational mobility outside agri-food systems than their main counterparts. We also looked at the quality of work that youth is doing in agri-food system, and we found that youth working, when they engage in agri-food system, their work is mostly precarious. So about 81% of young women and 83% of young men that work in agriculture, so on the top panel A of that graph, are in vulnerable employment. So we use the ILO definition of vulnerable employment and consider on-account workers and contributing family workers to be in vulnerable forms of employment. And the workers in off-farm agri-food systems are better off in that respect if you look at the panel B. There are also inequalities between young men and young women, and we found that young women were more likely to be in vulnerable jobs, especially as family workers, or also to be doing part-time work in agri-food systems. And 20% of youth are not in education, employment, or training, and among those 20%, 2/3 of them are young women who tend to engage more than men in unpaid and domestic work, which can have long-term consequences for their economic trajectories and livelihoods. The next set of outcomes is focusing on food insecurity and malnutrition, and we found that those are more common among youth. And we're interested in that because youth is a pivotal stage of growth that demands high dietary energy and nutrients. So this analysis using Gallup data is looking at the prevalence of food insecurity in the world, comparing youth and adults. And it found that youth food insecurity increased from about 17% in 2014 and 2016 to 24.4% between 2021 and 2023. And as you can see with the blue arrow, the increase is larger than adults. So now the prevalence of food insecurity is higher among youth than adults. On the right-hand side, you can see that Africa, that the highest prevalence of food insecurity is in Africa at about 42.7%, and Asia and the Pacific had the strongest rise. There are also inequalities based on the different groups, and this graph is really showing the age-specific probability of moderate and food severe insecurity. And as you can see, on the left-hand side of that graph, the risk of food insecurity is higher among young women. And on the right-hand side, it's also higher among young rural women, where we see that the trend is that we have a higher probability at the earlier stages, at the earlier ages, let's say. And when it comes to malnutrition, we saw the literature showing that there are also poor dietary patterns among youth with inadequate nutrient intake in iodine, vitamin E, calcium, all the select nutrients that you can see in that graph, and that contribute to dietary deficiencies. The last key findings I wanted to present is really on the last set of outcomes. We were interested in looking at the effects of shocks on youth, and we really looked at 3 different types of shocks. namely the economic downturns, climate change, and conflicts. So first, the economic downturns, we found that they have a more adverse impact on youth employment in agri-food systems. So we looked at the 2008-2009 economic crisis and the COVID-19. In the case of the COVID-19, we found that youth employment in agri-food systems declined by 2%, and it was really stronger for young women whose employment in agri-food system during COVID-19 declined by 7%. And as you can see on the latest row, this is really marked in the off-farm agri-food system where we have lower decline in youth employment in agri-food system, while for adults during the COVID-19, the employment crisis, the employment rate in agri-food system increased by 3%. We're also interested in the effects of weather shocks on young men and women on their labor outcomes. And we found that during extreme weather events, the responses will vary between young women and men. So for instance, heat stress, so the yellow estimates here, have a different effects for youth. So that leads to an increase in likelihood for youth compared to adults. And as you can see on this graph, is that it actually leads to an increase in the likelihood of youth working, but a decrease in the likelihood of young men, sorry, and the decrease in the likelihood of young women to work. And we also find stronger effects of flood on women's likelihood to work, the blue estimates. We also built on a study that was looking at the subjective resilience. So it's called the subjective self-evaluated resilience scores, and compared it to the RIMAS, so a more objective index of resilience. And in the context of 4 countries with protected crisis, the study is looking at the effects of age. And what we find is that the subjective resilience is higher among youth. So the age has age reduces the resilience. The age of the household head reduces the resilience of the household head. So that leads us to think that while there are no differences in the RIMA index, there is an effect of age on the subjective resilience, and which is higher among youth. So just would like to end with a few policy highlights from the report. Starting with the fact that achieving youth inclusive agri-food systems require 2 sets of actions. The first one is really, and you may remember the conceptual framework, we were thinking of the opportunities and the environment that youth are living in to expand and have broader economic opportunities for youth. But that also needs to be to come with targeted interventions for youth to equip them, and it's including vulnerable groups such as young women, rural poor, with the necessary skills, agency, and resources, such as providing them with access to quality education and training and agricultural inputs. And facilitating such youth access to those resources, including through intergenerational transfer of land, will enhance their engagement in agri-food systems. On the nutrition side, supporting youth involvement in food-related decisions could foster better dietary choices and health outcomes. And targeting youth with anticipatory social protection programs is critical to help build their resilience. And the report ends with a call for action. So as mentioned in introduction, youth are important to agri-food system. Agri-food systems are also important to youth, so they basically need each other. So youth need agri-food systems, and agri-food systems need youth. So we have a 3-point call for action. And the first one is really inquire more. So really to strengthen the evidence that can help inform policies and actions to build and foster youth-inclusive agri-food systems. To also include more, so really involve youth in policy-making spaces and in policies themselves so that they can be heard and be part of all those processes. And then finally, invest more. So one analysis that was done for the report really showed that promoting youth engagement in agri-food systems and eliminating youth unemployment and providing employment to youth that are in need could help boost the global GDP by 1.4%, and agri-food system would contribute to about 45% of that growth. and that's about 680 billion US dollars. So really investing more, safeguarding the future of youth in agri-food system can generate those large gains. And this is the third pillar, let's say, of this call for action. So on that, I'll stop there, but I want to really warmly thank you for your attention. And I'm really looking forward to the future exchanges and your feedback on that. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Marwan, for this very nice and comprehensive presentation. I would hand over to Kristen now for her intervention, and to the rest of you, if you have any questions, we'll have Q&A afterwards, but also feel free to type in the chat or in the Q&A. Thank you. Over to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you so much, Marwan, for putting out in such an interesting way the status report that I've been referring to a lot in my work, and what you've been presenting here really resonates a lot with some of the work I've done with CGIAR Gender Accelerator and also the FAO Investment Center as well on youth and their inclusion in agri-food systems. So yeah, especially with your conceptual framework, that broad enabling environment is really critical. We had also thought to include more information about the support systems, the projects, the services that are supporting or inhibiting youth from engaging in agri-food systems. And also just the fact that the enabling environment includes not only your formal policies and strategies, but also we have to think about the informal institutions, the rules, the norms that also affect how women and men, young people engage in agri-food systems. And I did like, the aspect that you've really brought out the gender differences in some of these findings, for instance, the migration patterns. But a lot of times we talk about youth as if they're one group of people, and in reality, it's women and men, it's married and unmarried, it's people living in very remote areas or more urbanized areas, and so we have to really bring more consideration, more attention to the intersectionality and the intersecting identities of the youth. It was exciting to see, as I'm writing a report on including youth in agri-food systems, that agri-food systems are a major employer of the youth. And I presume that means formal employment. It would be interesting also to see the opportunities to further engage youth through agripreneurial entrepreneurship in agriculture as well. And yeah, particularly your point at the end, it's very clear to inquire more and invest more and include more. But I'm writing this review currently for the gender conference taking place in Cape Town next month on methods to include youth in agri-food systems, food, land, and water systems. And so, the inquire more is really, really important to us. And we've been looking at, what are some of the gaps and how can researchers and others, really get more information, get more data on this. So it'll be really interesting to hear. What we've been finding so far is that, we're finding a lot of papers focused on Africa, where of course a lot of the youth are residing, but it's good that your status report has gone, across many different regions of the world, which is very nice as well. And then, yeah, in terms of the agency of the young people, I know that a lot of papers and research does focus on training programs, whether it's more formal or informal training programs, but there's also a lot of other opportunities through mentoring and coaching and even sort of the idea of apprenticeships that some educational systems have. So that would be something also to consider as well. So with that, I think I'll just leave more time for the questions and answers. I see some questions are coming in, but I look forward to the discussion with everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Would you want to react, Marwan?
Sure. No, thank you so much, Christine. I very much agree with everything you said and all the points that you raised. Those are very important, and I'm certainly happy to further exchange on those because they're still a lot that can be done to understand how youth engage in agri-food systems and what youth can bring to agri-food systems. And I mean, I just want to react to 2 points with which I very much agree, and that we faced when we worked on the report. Is the first one, the intersectionality. I very much agree, and we were really thinking in terms of who are the groups is not a homogeneous group. So I mentioned and we have this table in the report looking at the age, but there's also the intersectionality, there's also gender, there's also migration status, the marriage studies you mentioned as well. So there's all those aspects to consider. And one of the main caveat there is also the data. Sometimes we did not find the data to really look into the question in a robust manner. So to give an example, one aspect is that most of the time, for some of the analysis, we had to rely on the comparing youth-headed households against adult-headed households. And so that's somehow we're not considering some youth that are living in adult-headed, what is defined as adult-headed households. So, and they have a different aspects. Or we didn't have information, or there's little data on the actual assets and wealth of youth. We have household income, but we don't know how youth can access those, or so access land within a household. So I very much agree with you that it's important to consider intersectionality and really collecting data on those and having more data to really address that point is very important. And the other point, I mean, I very much agree with all your points. And the other point I also wanted to correct is really on the entrepreneurship. We also did not really necessarily have data on that, and that's certainly a question we were interested in looking into entrepreneurship in agriculture, but also in what we call the hidden middle, right, in the off-farm segments of the agri-food systems. And I think there's a lot to learn on that, and I very much agree with your point that those are orientations to follow. But yeah, I'll leave more time for Q&A, but I fully agree with everything you said. So thank you for taking the time to review and discuss this.
Thank you very much. I see we have one question in the Q&A section. Kelvin, can you unmute yourself, or should we read it out? Are you in a place where you can talk? Are you driving a car, maybe? Hi, good. Maybe it's better if you... Yeah. Yes, we hear you.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
I'm able to talk. I just wanted to find out. Thank you, Marwan, for the presentation. I think it's very comprehensive in terms of covering the youth statistics. But I was just wondering on the food security measures and the statistics you're presenting. Is that food security measured at the individual level within the household, or is that more of youth-headed households versus, adult-headed households, youth female-headed households, youth male-headed households? And if it's at the individual level within the household, I'm just wondering what explains those disparities.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. That's a very important question, and I should have mentioned that in the presentation. So for the food security measure is an individual level measures. It's the FIES data that we have at the FAO. So it's really the food insecurity experience scales data, and that we have for individuals. So it's not at the household level; it's really at the individual level. So what the age, for instance, the graph that you saw with the probability of being food insecure by age, really at the individual level, and the same for the prevalences.
Okay, thanks. I guess that's clear. If there's further questions, colleagues, please raise your hand or use the chat or the Q&A section. In the meantime, while colleagues are thinking, I would have a question. I mean, I imagine that it's challenging to write up such a report at a global scale, right? You said it yourself in the presentation, there's a lot of data gaps, and it was also one of your main policy implications or conclusions: inquire more, right? Or investigate more, find out more. So I just wanted to ask, where do you see the biggest gaps, the biggest knowledge gaps, the biggest data gaps, where it was really tough to find any data? I mean, in some of your sections, you had to restrict your findings to a couple of countries, I guess, because that's where data were available, right? And in other countries, they don't have that data available, or there's some other shortcomings. So maybe just in general terms, what are the main data gaps that you have observed in terms of youth in agri-food systems, and how do you think this could be addressed? Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. No, it's a very interesting questions, and I'm not sure whether I can provide a comprehensive answer because I may also be biased on what we actually faced, and others colleagues will say no, but we also have data missing in that domain, that area. So take my response with a grain of salt. Certainly won't be incomplete, but it won't be complete. But some of the gaps that we found was again the individual access to assets and wealth was sometimes missing, right? We wanted to look, for instance, at the effects of some aspects on income, but we only had measures of household income, and we're not sure how much would actually go to youth or would be actually allocated to youth. Same thing for access to land. And access to those resources, for instance, I know there's the LSMS plus data in 4 countries that have shown that it is important to, and there is some emerging research important to also have individual level data on access to assets and wealth. So this is maybe one topic where we have data, where data could be helpful. Also migration. I mean, we often know. We either know where households have a youth who migrated or whether a youth or somebody, and that's what we did in the report using the DHS survey, has ever migrated. But we don't necessarily have all the details we want on youth migration, what's happening for, let's say, single individual who migrated, what were the situation both at their origin and at the destination, right? You have a full picture. You usually have one side of the picture. So that's also where you have a gap. Another gap was also in employment. So we relied a lot on data that were provided by ILO, and we thank them. We thank them for that. But sometimes there's also no, unemployment data, we did not face it. That's what I meant. We approach ILO, and they actually provide us with ad hoc cross-tabulated data. So they really helped us address some of the gaps that we had. So we had data that were, and that comes to the intersection. Sorry, I got confused. But we had data disaggregated by 3 aspects. It's age, sex, and rural location, but we didn't have it by agri-food systems. So we couldn't really look at that. So we approached ILO, and they provided those data. So that was one way to somehow address this gap. So this gives an example of how we managed to somehow overcome some of the data gaps that we had to address those intersectionality in youth employment in agri-food systems and look at different groups of youth. There are also other gaps that were mentioned in the literature in terms of the evaluation, the effectiveness of interventions to engage youth for youth employment in rural areas. There is a bias towards interventions in urban areas, but there is less evidence on rural areas. So this is also not a data gap, but also a knowledge gap that is being filled. But I'm sure there's also a lot of evidence to address that. So there are some gaps in different areas, but there's also some ways to fill them with existing data and also collect data, more data as mentioned with the individual access to assets and resources, for instance.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very, very clear. Wongai, do you want to unmute yourself? Can you, or should we read it out?
Yes, I can unmute myself. Thank you so much, Maron, for your presentation. It's really insightful. I was just thinking about the different types of food systems that you talk about. Does the report speak about the experiences of youth in fragile countries and the opportunities they can explore in agri-food systems? I guess the question is, where exactly do they fit, and what are they doing in your, like, what does your work show they're doing? Thank you.
Thank you, Vongai. No, that's a very interesting question, and we also try to tackle some of those aspects in the report. So the agri-food system typology was adapted for the state of food and agriculture. So the SOFA report that the FAO has developed in 2024, and added also a category of protected crisis. So we also looked at what's happening and what is the experience of youth in the context of those agri-food system and types of countries. So, for instance, in employment, we found a much higher reliance of youth and especially younger youth on agriculture compared to agri-food systems, to other types of agri-food systems in those contexts. So really, work in agriculture is much more prevalent in those countries. I think we also looked at food insecurity. I can't remember the exact number. I can very quickly look it up, but I think it was higher in the protected crisis context, especially for youth, compared to traditional and then more formalized agri-food systems. And then we also, the last chapter was really looking at crisis. So the results on resilience that I mentioned in the last outcome slide was really focusing on 4 countries with the settings of protected crisis, and that's what we found, that really youth somehow exhibit higher subjective resilience, right? So they think compared to adults that they have a better ability to cope with those with risks and shocks compared to adults for myriads of reasons. Optimism, they may also be more agile to move from a job to the other, to implement other coping strategies, and so on and so forth. The other study that we had for the report, or the other analysis, was looking at what's happening in cases of conflicts and how it affects labor outcomes for youth. And what we found is that as a result of labor of conflicts, young women tend to work more in agriculture. So maybe when the conflicts is actually affecting young male labor outcomes differently, because they may go to war, or there may be some more male casualties. Women, what the results show is that young women may take over more work in agriculture as a result. So those would be some of the insights we had on the context of countries with protected crisis.
Sorry, thank you very much. I guess thanks for these insights, Marwan. There's another question. Who's this? Sorry, CIMMYT, is this you? Yes. You
Hi
want to go ahead,
everyone.
CIMMYT?
Yes, Michael, it's me. Yeah,
How are
it's
you?
me. I
Good to
thought
see
you
you. Good to hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it's good to see and hear everyone. Yeah, Michael, thanks for putting me on the spot. I thought you were gonna read it for me, but it's fine. Firstly, I just really wanted to say, Marwan, this is absolutely fabulous work, very timely, very important. I'm particularly keen on, I'm a researcher, and I'm particularly keen on youth inclusion, but also to drive home the point Kristen was making on intersectional research. I just wanted to find out, in terms of including young people by amplifying their voices in policy and decision-making processes and spaces. Would you say you have identified any context-specific mechanisms and tools to ensure this inclusion? I'm asking because, you sort of like showing, the rural-urban divide, those who are connected, those who aren't, gender differences, levels of education. So would you say there's space to cover context-specific inclusion mechanisms to amplify youth voices? I hope it makes sense. It was a mouthful, apologies, but thank you so much for doing this. It's amazing work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words. I also share those with the whole team that worked on the report. So we didn't look into context-specific mechanism of integrating youth agency, also because there is not a lot of literature doing that, but more specific case studies and general mechanism, maybe to integrate always a difference between, let's say, rural youth and urban youth. So the whole last chapter is really looking into what works and what doesn't work to include or at least make agri-food systems work for youth. And part of it is really looking into the different types of collective actions, the different types of interventions, different types of structures that can help increase youth agencies, youth agency and youth voice into those platforms. So we also give a lot of reflections and examples on of such type of mechanisms, such as youth organization, youth collective organizations that can actually help increasing youth voice and agencies into the different platforms, or youth parliamentarians, these kind of things. But those were not necessarily context specific. We did not really looked at those mechanisms under a specific context, but took a broader perspective.
Thank you very much, Marwan.
Thank you, Marwan. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
I could not have phrased it like you, Sapati. That's what I ask you.
No worries. Thank you, though.
Maybe I have a bit of a Kristen, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, you can also go. Well, just in terms of investing more, I was thinking maybe that digital connectivity difference that we saw of young people, is this an opportunity, for investing more? What can you unpack that a little bit for us? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Christine. Yeah, so that's a very good point, and we had a part of the analysis that looked at different digital assets. I only mentioned internet, but this is also only one of the few examples that we looked at, and another example was also at the crossroads between financial assets and digital assets. That's mobile money, and we found that there is a large uptake of, increasing uptake of mobile money among youth. And these digital financial services. But you're also right of mentioning intersectionality, because what we found is also still a digital divide between rural and urban youth on the one hand, and young women and young men on the other hand. So we really have this location and gender divide that's still persisting. So while youth are in many contexts maybe more likely to adopt those digital technologies than adults, there is still some differences, heterogeneities among youth, and those need to be addressed. And we should definitely invest on making sure that we can somehow close that gap between the different groups. Also, I mentioned the internet, right? Access. 81% of global youth are using internet, but we found that in countries with lower incomes, it was only 5% of rural youth. So there is that divide also from context to the other. So that also needs to be addressed. So that in areas where youth are less likely to address those, to adopt digital technologies, there is a need to also invest. So in some areas, we need to increase youth access to those areas, and we also need to make sure that we close the different digital divides that still subsist. It's very, I fully agree with you.
So thanks. Maybe I have one a bit more provocative question or comment, and then I would also know, like, what is your next steps? I guess this is now this report, as we have also seen in the discussion, there are many different topics, right? You could dig deeper into. Do you have any concrete plans at FAO, or are you already working on some sort of follow-up or deep dive on any of these topics that are contained in the report? That's the one question. That's probably easier. And the other one, I just want to provoke a bit. You've shown this one graph, GDP or whatever agricultural productivity versus the share of youth involved in agri-food systems, and this is like this this downward curve, like what happens as well if you look at industrialized countries. Not a lot of people work anymore in agriculture or in the agri-food sector in general. So do you think that the future of youth is on the farm, really? Like, should they be starting to farm, working, producing crops or anything? Or is it more like, no, they should be engaging in services around the actual production system? Because I guess, the land issue, that will always be the case, as we go down the inheritance of land, it gets smaller and smaller. So probably there's a limit how much people can really make a meaningful living out of crop production or any kind of agricultural production in the future. Sorry, this is a bit at the very end. I'm putting you on the spot here, but maybe you can just whatever you like. Also your personal view. Thanks.
No, thank you, Michael. Michael, those are two very interesting questions. Sorry, I was trying to put the graphs when you were talking, and I miserably failed. Sorry about that. So first, our first question, yeah, we've identified a few questions that we want to further analyze, and we're working on a series of papers that are really looking more in depth into some of the empirical questions that we feel could be further explored. But it related to really all the outcomes that we presented: so employment, food security and nutrition, resilience to climate shocks or the impacts of climate shocks. So really looking into those questions, and we will further explore those two papers, but we're still at for some of them early stages. I'd be happy to further inform you when we have more results on those. But we plan to really build on that, because we feel there's more to inquire at the topic. Then on your second question, I mean, I think this is really an important question, and I mean, you mentioned the graph, and I think this graph is really key to respond to that question, because let me see if I managed to put it now on the slide. But okay, sorry, I'm struggling with two graphs, two monitors. Sorry, yeah. So because basically the recommendations are really country situation specific. So I've mentioned the types of agri-food systems. They're not necessarily, it's not a linear transition. It's really each type of agri-food system come with their own, let's say, challenges and opportunities. So in the case of more traditional agri-food system, I mean, sometimes also agriculture is the only livelihoods that people can access or can more easily access through working on the household farm. So there we need to also accompany them and making sure youth can make let me stop sharing. Can make a decent income and livelihood out of their out of farming, for instance, right? In other cases, as you move towards the agri-food system transition, then there is more off-farm work, right? More opportunities for use in the what is called all of Tomi's work on the hidden middle, right? More in food processing and services, and we need to make sure that also youth can benefit from those. And in those contexts where you do have a lot of youth, and agri-food system an important livelihood for youth. It is important. We know that youth will work and rely on agri-food system for the livelihood. So we need to make sure that they can make decent livelihoods and income from those. In countries where you have lower shares of your youth and youth tend to exit agri-food systems, then there is an issue of intergenerational renewal, and we need to make sure that we make agri-food system not youth-friendly, but more attractive to use, so that they actually can work in agri-food systems and want to work in those and make this also, again, a decent livelihood and decent income, so that we ensure some intergenerational renewal and the sustainability of Agrifood systems. So this is really very context specific, and really depends on whether we need to create more jobs for youth, whether those jobs are needed for large youth cohort, or whether we need to attract youth in Agrifood systems. I hope I responded.
No,
to
it's
your
very
question.
well. No, thank you so much. No, of course, it makes sense, right? It's context specific, and depending on where you are, you may want to take different types of measures or strategies, interventions. No, thank you so much. I think with this one, we are a little bit over the time. I thank you again, Marwan, for being with us, for presenting your work. Very interesting, and also like to congratulate you. I think it's very pertinent and very important that the focus is shifting more towards youth. Kristen, also thank you so much to you for being with us, for your interventions, and thanks to all colleagues for being with us, for staying a bit longer. We'll have our next Paula Kantor seminar at the end of October. Please stay tuned. We're always trying to provide you with good and interesting content, such as today. Thank you so much, everybody. I wish you all a good day, good end of the day, or start of the day. All the best, huh? Thank you. It was good to see you again, Marwan, huh?
Yeah, good to see you as well. Thank you for the invitation again.
Folks.
And thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.